Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Last week, as of this recording, I did a video where I briefly talked about ideology. While ideology was not one of the main focuses of that video, I was in fact talking about the Empire of South California. One of the things I mentioned in that video is that I think ideology does have some detrimental effects on art, but those shortcomings can also be compensated for if the right safeguards are in place. Now, I received some gentle pushback behind the scenes in some private messages from people who thought I should have expounded on that point some more because I was ruling ideology out as a potential source for the shortcomings of modern storytelling. It would have behooved me, I am told, to expound a little bit more on how ideology can put blinders on people and what I meant by having artistic integrity serve as a counterbalance to ideology in the creative process. Now, I didn't do that because that wasn't really the point of the video, and when you discuss ideology, it tends to get uncomfortable very fast. I was trying to make a quick, high-level overview of a social phenomena, not critique ideology in general. But I took the point under advisement, and I filed it away as something I might do in the future. And the future, it seems, is now. In order to have this discussion, I am going to stretch the definition of ideology a little bit. In the modern era, ideology is generally viewed as a series of ideas about politics and or culture that unite to form a vision of the world that has little to do with reality and which facts can do very little to dissuade you from. It's generally viewed as a harmful phenomenon. The use of ideology is generally kept so specific because if you were to broaden it out, anything could be an ideology. Your favorite sports team could be an ideology because you always believe they'll win, even though they lost the last, 12 games in a row or whatever. But I'm a writer, and I figured we'll take a look at ideology as it applies to art, specifically ideologies about writing a book or a short story. The ideology in question I'm going to call pulp ideology. It's a belief that the writing of the 1920s or even the 1910s, as late as perhaps the 1940s or 50s, was the pinnacle of American writing. It was concise, it was condensed, it told its story, and it got out. That famous Shakespearean quote that brevity is the soul of wit, that kind of encapsulates a lot of the pulp ideology. And we're going to use this as our case study because it's harmless. People talk about nationalism or socialism or theocracy, substitute whatever ideology you can think of here, and they automatically associate it with a ton of terrible historical incidents because all these ideologies have been implemented politically through force at various points in time, and it's always ended badly for a bunch of people. But pulp ideology, all it really does is it has an impact on storytelling, and that's fine. I think it's pretty much harmless. Hopefully that will let us look at it without too many feelings getting in the way. Okay? Okay. Furthermore, we're going to be looking at it as it is presented to us briefly by an author by the name of Misha Burnett. And let me start by saying I got no beef with Misha. I don't know much about his stories. I don't think I've ever read one of his books. I know he's been published in Sursova, which means he probably has pretty good writing chops. And that's about it. So don't read anything I'm saying here as a way of saying Misha's a bad author. He's not. He clearly is a published author of some respectability. But he has the pulp ideology, and we can examine some of the blind spots it creates for him in what he says here. So he starts out by saying, I loathe save the cat moments. If you're writing a character who is a decent person, then you don't have to go out of your way to show it. Right out the bat. Save the cat moments refer to a moment early in the story where the protagonist does something purely altruistic for someone else, usually someone much weaker than they are, as a way of indicating their character. I have discussed this trope at length in the videos Analysis is Not Creation and Pitch to Your Audience, Not Producers. So I'm not going to rehash my own thoughts on Save the Cat here. I'm more interested in how Misha interprets the Save the Cat moment. First of all, note the contrast between how Draft to Digital, the tweeter that Misha is responding to, characterizes protagonists and the way that Misha characterizes protagonists. Draft to Digital says saving the cat is about showing an admirable or redeemable protagonist, whereas Misha says the protagonist is a decent person. Already, we are talking about two different things. And we are talking about two different things because Misha is in the mindset of the pulp ideology. The protagonist of a pulp story is almost always a normal person. There are exceptions, particularly in pulp fantasy, but in general, the pulp protagonist is just a decent human being. Whereas Draft 2 Digital seems to be speaking of a protagonist who is a little bit beyond just a decent human being. They are, in fact, admirable, or perhaps they are less than admirable, and we want to redeem them to a state where they are admirable. Already, we have people talking past each other. And usually, when people are talking past each other, it's because they have an ideology that puts them at odds, or at least one of them has an ideology that causes them to view everything someone else says in the wrong light. Not necessarily a bad light, you're just recontextualizing it in a way that was not intended. And that happens again when Misha says, you don't have to go out of your way. Remember, the pulp ideology likes to be quick and concise. They eschew extraneous detail. But nothing about the save the cat trope implies extraneous detail. It just asks for a moment of altruism early in the story. There's no reason not to have a moment of altruism in the story. There's no reason that can't be an integral part of your story. Misha continues, saying, where this trope comes from, in my opinion, is writers who want to write action-oriented protagonists because they sell, but personally despise the masculine traits that make a good action-oriented protagonist. So they feel the need to sell the hero by showing a softer side, which generally is at odds with the way the hero acts during the rest of the story. We don't need to see a genuine protector archetype saving a cat. He saves people by his actions. Now, this trope actually comes from a book called Save the Cat, which is a book for screenwriters. Again, more on that in my videos where I actually talk about this trope. And it ironically actually came about because screenwriters were looking to condense the idea of altruism down to its shortest, most concise possible form. They were actually trying to be pulp storytellers, and they were trying to show that a person will protect anyone by showing them protecting the least valuable people out there. It doesn't have to be a cat. The author of the book just used this as an example because of the moment where Mr. Incredible saves a cat at the beginning of The Incredibles. Ironically, not a moment that shows Mr. Incredible's softer side at all. But again, we see pulp ideology in play here. Pulp is a perfectly fine and respectable format from the American storytelling tradition. But it's kind of on the outs right now. Not, in my opinion, because it serves no purpose, but because the kind of pulp magazines that the format takes its name from is not a good medium for telling pulp stories anymore. Pulp stories are generally told through television, or if you want the really concise stories, through YouTube, or TikTok, or Reddit. And you'll notice that 2 of those 3 venues are multimedia. You can use images to tell your story along with the words, and that really helps you be very concise. Furthermore, these venues are free. Traditional publishing just can't compete with them, both in terms of how concise they can be and with their price point. However, the pulp ideology does not simply respect the pulp format and the innovations it brought in its time period. It believes it to be the best format for storytelling there is. And so it must be on the outs for some reason other than the rise of other formats that allow pulp-style stories to be told more effectively. So when you're subscribed to the pulp ideology, you look around for other potential causes of the lapse in pulp stories, and you see that, hey, the publishing industry caters almost entirely to women now. Okay, that must mean that writers don't like the masculine behavior of pulp characters, right? Thus, Misha's presumption that the masculine-feminine divide is the source of this trope, when in fact it is not. It has a lot more to do with the way Hollywood doles out money. And remember, the primary storytellers in our culture come from Imperial SoCal. They do not come from New York. However, we also see in these tweets that Misha still has a strong sense of artistic integrity. He points out that slavishly devoting yourself to the Save the Cat formula can in fact create characters who take actions early in the story that are at odds with the actions they take later in the story. I myself have seen this quite a bit. You'll see a character save a small child from danger, perhaps, in the first couple of pages of a book, and then for the rest of the story, they can be very calloused towards children. They can be very violent towards children, even. Or they may spare a warm moment for a homeless person that they give some spare change, and then spend the rest of the story greedily and rudely interacting with every other person they stumble across. While a certain amount of intentionality can turn that into an illuminating character beat, for the most part, it's just schlock that doesn't match up. Misha's entirely correct there. You do have to take the time and spend the energy on making sure your entire story serves the purpose of your story. You can use any tropes you want, including the save the cat trope, but if you're not intentional in the way you use those tropes, you're going to have a mess. Now, I had originally intended to leave it there, but it turns out Misha did some follow-up tweets, which I'm going to put on screen here. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. He just gives an example of the way he thinks about the save the cat moment, namely as extraneous details. He gives an example about telling your boss why you were late from work, and how it would be extraneous to explain the circumstances from your side of the story as well as from the side of the story of the person who caused an accident. It's a perfectly cogent and well-reasoned point, but he does wrap it up by saying that this is why fantasy authors now require 3 doorstopper books to tell a story that pulp masters could have told in 60,000 words. And again, I think this just shows that he is speaking from this pulp ideology, where you have to keep everything as short and concise as possible. And he continues to make the foolish assumption that all save the cat moments are extraneous to the story, when they don't have to be. Neither do they have to introduce character dissonance. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Nate, that's all well and good. It shows that Misha is talking at cross purposes with other people because of his ideology, because of his devotion to the pulp format. But what kind of impact will that have on his art? I mean, sure, he may not use a selection of tropes, but so what? Is that bad for your art? Well, to a certain extent, no, it's not. That's why I said it's a harmless ideology. Except, the goal of storytelling is to communicate to your audience. You have a story in your mind, you need to get it into their mind. The story is transmitted via words from you to your audience, assuming you are a novelist or a verbal storyteller. If you and your audience are speaking at cross purposes, your stories are going to suffer for it. With a little bit of ideology, if you just subscribe to the pulp ideology, or the Baltimore Orioles ideology, or the peanut butter toast on the bottom side ideology, guess what? It's probably not going to cause huge issues in your storytelling. But as that ideology gets bigger and more encompassing, as it pulls in every aspect of culture and society, then yeah, that ideology could very well result in you talking at cross purposes with your audience constantly. And if you intend to avoid that, you will have to really dedicate yourself to artistic integrity in order to make sure that your story avoids those linguistic traps. That's what I meant when I said ideology can be a hindrance to good storytelling. But if you have good artistic integrity, if you have enough people on the team with enough different points of view, you can compensate for that. I think it's a perfectly legitimate way to look at storytelling, and especially collaborative storytelling. Now, admittedly, novels and short stories, they tend to be solo writing exercises, yeah. But in the Empire of Southern California video, I wasn't talking about novels or short stories. I was talking about Hollywood, which is very collaborative. Because Hollywood is the primary source of Western storytelling in the modern age, whether you like it or not. So, now that we've talked about ideology a little bit, let's talk about my book. Have Spell Will Travel collects 8 novellas and short stories, chronicling the adventures of the legendary fire spinner Roy Harper, a magic-wielding mercenary who makes his way through the Colombian West, one bounty at a time. The great Amazon algorithms have seen fit to approve my book for publication, so you can purchase it at the link down below. Stay tuned to this YouTube channel over the next week. I hope to do a couple of stories breaking down each of the novellas and what they're about, and then do another video on the 4 short stories to give you an idea of what to expect if you pick up the book. So if you're on the fence about it, I hope to win you over. In the meantime, whether it's about the book or about ideology, let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.